Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What a great crowd. Thanks for coming out. Senator Wyden's going to be introduced in just a minute. We're not going to give him short shrift. He's going to be introduced in just a little bit. But thank you for coming out. We're going to talk a little bit about privacy and surveillance. And when I think about it, I try to think about where did all this come from and where's the battle come from and did it have anything to do with the beginning of our country? And to me, I look at the Bill of Rights and I say, well, what is sort of a principle that underlies all of the Bill of Rights? So, you know, you have this idea that you can practice your religion. You have this idea that your records are safe in your house. You have all these things, that you get due process, that you have jurisprudence. You get a jury, you get a trial, you get a lawyer. And I think, well, what's really the important principle underlying all of this? I think it's the presumption of innocence, that we are presumed to be innocent, and so the government has a burden. So when we get to the idea of whether the government can come in your house, we say, yes, but only under certain circumstances. We're presumed to be innocent, so the government just can't come in for any reason. And this was a big deal to the Founding Fathers. So in like 1760s, you got James Otis in our country, but you got John Wilkes in England. And they're both fighting against something they call general warrants, or writs of assistance. And they're arguing that you can't just have a warrant that says you can go out and go into anybody's house. And John Wilkes actually was so famous that he was famous in our country as well. And he printed something about the King of England and about the government, and it was called North Britain 45. It was so famous that there was a rallying cry called Wilkes and Liberty. 45 was so famous even in our country that often people would have 45 drinks served to 45 friends to commemorate 45 in its association with liberty. Now, that's 45 drinks to 45 different friends, not 45 drinks for one friend, all right? 45 drinks for 45 different friends. But it was a big deal. He beat the King of England. The King of England had to give him 4,000 pounds for using a general warrant to break up his printing press. Same thing happens over here. James Otis argues against this idea of general warrants. John Adams said this was the spark that led to the revolution, so it was a big deal. So we get the Fourth Amendment. How's the Fourth Amendment different than a general warrant? Fourth Amendment says you have to say someone's name. If you want someone's records, you got to name them. You got to name where the records are, what the records are, and then you have to have probable cause. You have to have a pretty strong reason why you go into someone's house. So the government's allowed to come to your house, but only under very, very strict reasons. So we get the Fourth Amendment. We go along for quite a while, and we get to sort of the modern era where it's changing. It's just not papers in your house, it's phone conversations. So there's a famous case in privacy called the Olmstead case from 1928. And in that, the court rules that your phone conversations are not private because you've allowed a third party to have it, and so the government can listen without a warrant. And I think this was a terrible decision, and so did Justice Brandeis, who's famous for his dissent, which is much more famous than the majority. And he says, in his dissent, he says, the most cherished right of men and women, of civilized men and women, is the right to be left alone. And that's what I think what brings a lot of us together and brings Ron and I together. You're supposed to have a lot of rights to be left alone from government. But in this case, the majority rules that your phone conversations are not private. It goes 40 years to the Katz case in 1968. In that case, they reverse it and say phone conversations are protected. But then there's another big case in the late 70s, and what they decide then is that your conversation is protected. A judge can't listen to your phone call without a warrant, but they can get all the extra information without a warrant. Metadata, who you called and how long you spoke. And people say, well, it's no big deal. It's just a bunch of numbers and it's not yours. Well, it is a big deal because if I know who you called and how long you talked to, 85% of the time I can tell your religion. Most of the time I can tell your doctors. In fact, if I infer what the doctor does, I can infer what you're going to the doctor for. I can get a hold of your medications. There's all kinds of things the government can do that they shouldn't be doing if we allow them to look at metadata. But that is the law right now. The court has decided since the 70s the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect your records once they belong to a bank or once they belong to a phone company. Where did this lead? This led to something that most of us didn't even know existed, the bulk collection of metadata. And this is where Senator Wyden came in, and I'm going to turn it over to him in just a minute, is that this whole idea, many of us didn't even know this, but Senator Wyden's on the Intelligence Committee, so he knew some of what was going on. I'm going to let him tell the story. But this gets us up to the current day, where your third-party records, if you deal with a bank or a phone company, or everything, a lot of things that are recorded on your devices and your phones, isn't protected by the Fourth Amendment. Some of us think the court needs to go the other way. There is the Carpenter case right now that some people think will start to restrict the government's access to this. But we get to this era, which is in the last couple years, where the government's collecting everything and storing it in Utah. And with that, I'm going to go to Senator Wyden's introduction, and then we'll let him pick up the story.